Well, maybe just welcome everyone. The Missouri Sedimentation Action Coalition is hosting our webinar today. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with us. We're a nonprofit organization concerned about the sediment that's filling in the reservoirs on the Missouri River. And that's happening at Lewis and Clark Lake behind Gavins Point Dam near Yankton, South Dakota. And that's one of the spots that was featured in Tyler's book that was just released in April. We have our board president here, Mark Simpson, and we'll have him welcome you as well. And then we'll turn it over to Jerry Oster. He's our facilitator or question person. He's with WNAX in Yankton, longtime news director. And Tyler has experience writing for many newspapers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, among others. And I guess when I first heard from him and I learned that, as far as MSAC, we want to get our word out, and we were more than happy to welcome Tyler to the area and talk with him. Mark, would you like to?
Sure, I'll say a couple words. Just thank you everyone for being here. Tyler was here back in 2018, if our memory serves us. It was a great time taking him around. We took him down to the Santee Sioux tribe. We showed him Brazil Creek. We showed him all around the area. He's a man with great deal of knowledge and a great deal of questions for all of us. And I think the thing that we take from it is not what we already know, but just his book, Holding Back the River. And I think he's got a link in the chat room for those of you that might be interested. It would be a good idea just to read it. It's a wonderful history. It's a wonderful documentary on man's struggle to tame the rivers that are, in most cases, untamable. Jerry and Tyler, I'll let you have at it.
Well, thank you for that excellent introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Sorry, Jerry.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank Mark for that excellent introduction, and thank him and Sandy also for their hospitality and patience while I was up in the Niobrara and Springfield region. As Mark said, I asked a lot of questions, and they gave a lot of interesting answers and just really helped me see the area and travel through the area, which I always like to do by plane and by boat. And that gave me a real visceral sense of what's going on there. So I really appreciate that. And I think hopefully it informed the book and made it better. So Jerry, sorry to cut you off.
No, that's okay. I was just going to welcome you too. And I guess what I took from the book and the liner notes especially was seeing you grew up along the Mississippi, as you said, in the Twin Cities. Is that where your interest came from? Or, where'd you get the interest in writing the book?
Yeah, I did grow up in Minneapolis. I think I was always aware that big rivers exist, which I think some people on the coast don't even know that much. And so I had a leg up in terms of that growing up in Minneapolis. But I think later in my life, I took some kind of camping trips down along the Mississippi and seeing these lock and dams, one after the other, these massive, ambitious, hubristic structures. I was really taken when I realized that one agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, had proposed to sort of control these massive, powerful natural forces. And I didn't know that, having grown up on the river, it was just sort of the segment that I saw near, my hometown. And I didn't know this, federal government had proposed to say, hey, we're going to boss this thing around and, make it serve our needs. And I was just really impressed by the ambition and the hubris of that proposal, I guess is a way to put it.
They call it the Mississippi River system, but as I'm clear, it's kind of two systems. It's the Mississippi and the Ohio, and then it's the Missouri. There's quite the differences between the two, isn't there?
Yeah, really they are. And I think each one sort of evolved separately with different batches of legislation coming out of Congress, different politicians and agencies wanting different things from the rivers. And I think, unfortunately for the Missouri, it seems to be one of the rivers that has the most demands placed upon it. Everyone I'm sure listening knows about these 8 authorized purposes that the Army Corps is charged with sort of satisfying on the Missouri. And really, it seems to me that it's an impossible task to please all these different entities. And I think actually rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi have it easier in a way in terms of management because they aren't being pulled in all these different directions. I think it's clearer if you go visit those places that, navigation and flood control is really what it's all about. And on the upper Mississippi, there's also a priority on sort of the ecology and the landscape, but there doesn't seem to be this feeling of being pulled in so many different directions that, you kind of don't do any of them very well, which is how I really felt when I was up on the Missouri.
Yeah, you may know people in this part of the world figure it should be called the Missouri River System because actually the Missouri is longer than the Mississippi if you go to the headwaters.
Of course, yeah, that's true. And the Ohio actually supplies the majority of the water. So if you were to follow the water, you would go up to Pittsburgh and start the Mississippi. And I don't know the history of how those names got assigned, but.
Oh, that goes back in history. I think too, you pointed out in history too, the Corps has been involved with the river for a long time, especially the Ohio and the Mississippi.
Right. I mean, the Corps really got its start with the Ohio and the Mississippi in the 1820s. It started getting involved in navigation when navigation sort of became seen as a federal need, sort of essentially justifiable as something the military would intervene on behalf of, because that's what the Corps was. Obviously, it began with the Army. And so it was sort of a strange moment in history. And I looked at it some in the book when shortly after the Revolution, the sort of Western United States was the Ohio River Valley. That was sort of the frontier where people were moving. And I think the federal government decided that it was in the interest of, the young and growing nation to make that artery, that commercial artery, the Ohio River, improve that commercial artery. So, the federal government went on to build roads and subsidize railways and do all kinds of other stuff with transportation. But I think that was an interesting moment in history. If you look at how did the United States Army get involved on the river? And right now, you look at it on the face and it doesn't really make that much sense. But, going back at that moment, and, you think about also the fact that the engineers at the Corps were some of the only people who understood hydrology and hydraulics. And so I think in terms of the time, like President Jefferson, they were the only experts to turn to. But it's also, I think, important to note that, and I talk about this, that the development of the rivers also, came with, persecuting and pushing out indigenous people all along the way. And that began, of course, it began before the founding of the country, but, as the rivers were developed and as they were improved, indigenous people were pushed out of the Ohio Valley. They were pushed further and further west, and they kept getting pushed. And so that sort of, the progress of colonialism is also sort of at the same time the story of this development of our rivers. And so I was interested in how those two things were sort of connected. And in a way, it's almost kind of there's sort of like a Judeo-Christian colonialist kind of attitude, I think, that you kind of come from if you're saying we're going to dominate these natural forces and we're going to tell them what to do and we're going to make them serve our interests. And, that's what we've done as a country. And I think everyone has probably benefited, but it comes from a certain worldview, I guess. And I tried to sort of acknowledge that in the book.
Yeah, there is a long history of that. The other thing I think we should note is there's quite a difference between the lower Mississippi with the levee system, as we don't have levees here. They start south of Sioux City on the Missouri, so our part of the river, some of the last wild and free, but the levee system really made a difference especially on the lower Mississippi, didn't it?
Tremendous difference. Yeah. And, this is something to talk about, not really in your area, further downstream, really, but the levee system along the lower Mississippi actually does a fantastic job of containing, the Corps doesn't want to use the word controlling anymore, floods. Whereas the sort of piecemeal levee system that arose after the Pick-Sloan Act of 44 along the lower Missouri really does not work very well, as anyone probably can remember or has seen for themselves, because it gets, overtopped what seems like a regular basis now. But, I think the important thing there is that the devastating flood of 1927 is what sort of allowed the parochial interests that had been fighting each other in kind of the levee war, this county versus that county and this state versus that state. This catastrophic flood in 1927 demolished all of those efforts and sort of subjugated those special interests and allowed the Mississippi River Commission, which occupies an interesting role kind of between the federal government and the more parochial local interests, to come in and say, okay, we have a plan and we can put this plan in place, but you have to give up so much land because we're going to set the levees back. But in return for giving up the land, you're going to receive a really terrific flood control system. And you can go back and look at the Missouri and ask, how was that opportunity missed on the Missouri? The opportunity to really put in place a comprehensive flood control system. In 1993, I think, was one moment when it could have happened. But for some reason, the political will wasn't there. The way the changes were sort of presented to the stakeholders wasn't there. It was done poorly. 2011, it could have happened. And then, of course, 2019. But so it's interesting to think that a flood like what happened in 2019 in the lower river, it really could have been avoided because you could have built a better system that could have contained that flood, and yet it wasn't done. So in a sense, that all that tragedy and destruction is not a result of climate change or a really bad flood. It's a result of poor planning and unwillingness, to give back land and make hard decisions at a certain moment in time.
Yeah, I think, as you said, the Corps discovered the difference between contain and control, that neither one is possible at times in terms of the flooding. The other part that struck me too was that navigation on the Missouri was part of the promise early on, and that never really materialized. I mean, there's some navigation, some barge traffic to Sioux City, but very little. And for the amount of water that flows through there, I mean, it's negligible compared to the Mississippi, obviously. So, I mean, this part of the Missouri really lost out in that whole deal.
Absolutely. And I would say probably everyone in the valley, except for maybe a few, barge operators, lost out because the way in which the river was reshaped in the name of navigation, I think, was really destructive and detrimental really to a lot of the other authorized purposes, let alone you can go and talk about the habitats that were built for the pallid sturgeon, the least tern and the piping plover, how much money was spent on those habitats, how ineffective those habitats were, what a waste of money that was, about $800 million last time I checked. And, arguably, if the Corps had been able to change the way it released water from Gavins Point to mimic the historic rise and fall of the river, they wouldn't have had to build any of those habitats. But then they would have had to go against navigation, right? But what's the benefit of navigation to the region? I don't know, $7 million in one study I looked at annually. And so no one's ever compared these things, but you're spending $800 million on habitats that don't work, and you're gaining benefit of $7 million annually in navigation. That doesn't make sense, I think, to anyone who look at the figures side by side. But again, the authorities, the mandates, the priorities on the Missouri are really strange and conflicting and contradictory and backward. And again, it's not, I wouldn't blame the Army Corps of Engineers because the Corps can't deauthorize a navigation mission on the Missouri. It's in a law. Congress told them to do it. They have to keep doing it. So someone who can step back and sort of do more of a reimagining would need to fix some of these problems. It's not for the Army Corps of Engineers to fix. Even though they're in the unenviable job of trying to please all these people who they're never going to please, and will just, keep suing them probably. But it's true. I mean, if you look at the costs and benefits of some of these actions, it really doesn't add up.
So let's move to the whole dams themselves. I thought you had an interesting description in the book of the Pick-Sloan plan as basically a shotgun union type of thing between the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps, where it wasn't really a compromise. It was what they kind of worked out, starting with Fort Peck in Montana and working their way down the river. I mean, that really was a compromise, more or less in the worst way, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I that shotgun wedding phrase came from somewhere else. I can't remember. I think it was maybe a Forest Service or a reclamation paper I read, but exactly. So, the way the story is told, and I think this is true, it's basically two federal agencies jockeying for power. And there was actually talk of a Missouri Valley Authority, similar to the Tennessee Valley Authority, which, looking back on it, in my opinion, would have probably been a really good idea because TVA is quite successful. And I think we need more authorities like that. But basically, I think the Corps and Reclamation saw the specter of an MVA, Missouri Valley Authority, and said, okay, we can't do that. So instead of jockeying for power, let's agree to share power, because sharing power is better than no power at all. So then they put together this uncomfortable mashup of Reclamation's priorities, which were irrigation and power generation, and the Corps' priorities, which were flood control and navigation. And so basically giving a little bit to all of those four sort of buckets, if you will, and essentially kind of not, in the end, not really doing any of them that well. So that's sort of the unfortunate history of PIC Sloan. And I think that really is what happened.
Well, yeah, and you touched about the irrigation. That's when I started my career back in the 70s, the Oahe irrigation plant in northern South Dakota. And that was such a battle, ultimately deauthorized some years later. But that was one of those promises that was made and not kept. And I think we've seen that all the way along the river as the dams were built. Other promises were there. Power's been pretty generally held up, most of the hydropower. Of course, that goes a lot of it out of the region on the grid, which is okay. Water supplies, that's kind of gone up and down. The land loss was terrific for some, especially tribes along the river. You know, they did get some water rights out of that. I mean, the trade-offs were really expensive for some folks, weren't they?
Absolutely. And one of the really interesting things when you look at large river management is the trade-offs are the people who pay, the people who suffer, you know, and the people who benefit, the people who win are usually vastly distributed across the country. And so I don't know if Kansas City and Omaha know, you know, that they are staying dry because of, you know, all the land that the Arikara, Hidatsa, and Mandan gave up, you know, way up in North Dakota. So, you know, this tribe loses its best farmland, hundreds of thousands of acres, and these metropolises 1,000 miles away or more, you know, are preserved from flooding. And I think it's not that is a bad trade-off necessarily. I'm not saying it was, but I don't think it was portrayed that way at the time. It wasn't portrayed as, you know, you suffer, you benefit. So, you know, how does the compensation work? You know, are we upfront about the winners and losers that we're choosing when we set up a project like this? And I don't think they were. And I doubt the compensation was adequate. But you see that all the time. And the Mississippi has these spillways where they deliberately divert water out of the river and flood private land whenever the river rises to a certain height. And there it's much more sort of out in the open that, you know, these people are the losers of this project. And, you know, 4 million people and tons of economic development exists in the Mississippi Valley, and it exists because this flood control system is there. So you can clearly see we need this. We need these levees. They work. And yet there are these people who are the obvious losers. And again, it's often poor people, people of color. And so it's not that you can have everybody win when you're dealing with this much risk. You can't. But I think there's a more equitable way to assess and to compensate those who are going to lose. And I think the federal government's done that pretty poorly almost across the board.
And in the book, you brought up an interesting point and about Lewis and Clark Lake and Gavins Point Dam. That was basically a vanity project, a recreation project for Yankton. Now I wasn't here the whole time it was built. I guess I've never heard it described that way. You think that's fair? You think that's accurate?
Well, I don't think I used the word vanity project, so I won't.
No, I did.
So
you basically said it was built for recreation for Yankton.
Well, you know, Sandy actually helped me on the sleuthing of this, and we pulled up a document, I think it was from 49, talking about the authorizing of Gavins Point. It wasn't even named Gavins Point then, and they were discussing different locations and, you know, which locations would have more flood control benefit, which locations would have more recreation benefit. And it did seem like the final location, which is further to Yankton, which I believe is not at Gavins Point. I think Gavins Point is several miles, would be up the lake. So they didn't choose the Gavins Point location. They chose the Yankton location. And there is a quote in that document that says something like, you know, the potential for recreation is tremendous, or something like that. So, you know, I think originally they weren't even going to put a dam there in PIC Sloan, and then eventually they decided they were going to put a dam there, and then there was debate about where to put the dam. And it does appear that the final decision about where to put it was influenced by, you know, recreation is a benefit. So, you know, that's real, an economic benefit, but I think it was influenced by that. And it seems like I've never seen anything that could contradict that. Basically, that's probably the best answer to your question, is I've never seen anything that proved otherwise.
Well, I think you made a good point too about putting the dam downstream of the Niobrara. And as Mark knows, with Niobrara, the town on wheels there that's had to move, 3 times now. that a dam above Niobrara, or even just stopping at Fort Randall, might have been the best solution.
Yes, absolutely. And if you can, again, back to our earlier conversation, if you can get rid of navigation, which again has, essentially negligible benefit to the entire valley, if you look at it that way, then I don't think you need Gavins Point. Maybe you can get rid of it entirely. I mean, you still have the recreation, of course, which would be a major loss. But if you were to sort of undo things, and probably they can't be undone at this point, but the only justification for Gavins originally was as a re-regulation dam to quiet the irregular flows out of Fort Randall that come from power generation. And the only reason it needed to be re-regulated, right, was for navigation. So if you start unwinding, I doubt anyone could ever get Gavins taken down. It's way too large, and I think there's way too many things set up, water intakes, recreation businesses that you would disrupt. So I don't think that's possible. But yeah, if you were to go back forensically and say, if you don't need navigation, you're not putting such a priority on recreation, I'm not sure what you need Gavins for. But again, these things, I'm sure MSAC members and as well as Mark and Sandy probably have better information on this than I do. So they may be pulling their hair out right now listening to me talk, but
I'm sure it's nothing they haven't talked about before. And the whole sediment issue is obviously, why they formed, what they're doing. And Paul Boyd, as you talked to in the book, has had a lot of good ideas about that. But it seems like it's hard to come up with something that's going to work, that people can agree on, that even with a test type plot, that's been talked about for a number of years. I mean, is there any solution out there that you've heard that is viable?
I mean, I think, again, I would defer to Paul Boyd. Of course, he's not here, but I think there are some solutions. It's just a question of getting the funding, right? And the problem is, and I spent, a great afternoon with Paul Boyd. You talk to him and you get the sense that these problems can be solved. But again, the bureaucratic rules of the Corps prohibit basically Paul from implementing the solutions that he sees. And so again, the Corps uses this system of costs and benefits. And so that is how almost everything they do, all the money they spend, gets justified. And I think Paul would have a hard time getting any of the sediment sort of transport ideas he has, get any of them done because of the cost benefit system, because you have to look forward in time and say, what are the benefits to the future of putting this in? And, you'd have to also, I believe, prove that they were in the near term. So if you say this lake won't in 100 years be full of sediment, if we spend $300 million retrofitting the dam now, it probably wouldn't meet their criteria. The math wouldn't add up. And so I think that was, Boyd is such a smart guy, and he has so much energy and good intentions. And he really felt to me like was frustrated by the confines of these rules and this bureaucracy. And I know Sandy and Mark have worked really hard to try to find an angle, so to speak, how to wend your way and find a little word or a bit of language in some bill that you can try to get something done. But I think everyone is sort of frustrated by the same thing. Although, I have to say, and this sort of happened after my book, that there's the December 2020 Water Resources Bill, I think did have some language about sediment management in it. And that came out after my book, but that would sort of be obviously a really good step in the right direction. And Sandy and Mark can talk more about what can be done with that language. I don't know how, what the guidance is or how it could be implemented. But again, I can look at things in a common sense way that people in the Corps can't, but they've already spent, well over $300 million on the effects, buying back, mitigating the effects of all the sediment, right? Buying out land, moving Niobrara, all these takings cases, moving Highway 12, and that is only going to build. It's only going to add up. And so to me, it seems so silly to continue ad nauseum spending money, on the effect of something when you don't do anything about the cause. But, as Paul Boyd said to me, you could have spent $300 million and created a way to manage sediment in the dam forever, or you can just keep paying and paying and paying and paying more and more land is going to go underwater. More and more people are going to sue the Corps and win. So it just seems like, again, the rules, the bureaucracy creates this system where we, the taxpayer, are going to keep paying for this mistake, this short-sighted planning that someone did in the 1950s. And that's just what's going to happen instead of fixing the problem. And that seems to be the way it's set up.
As we speak of sediment, you had an interesting term, and I don't know if you got it from Paul, about a hungry river downstream of Gavins Point Dam. What is a hungry river?
Yeah, and so I did learn that from Paul. And what I learned is that the moving water wants to have a certain amount of sediment in solution at all times. And so because the I guess it'd be the outfalls from Gavins Point Dam come out high, the water is totally clear, sediment free. And so when that sediment free water hits the river in Yankton, it starts to erode because it wants to pick up sediment and carry sediment. And so I think the riverbed at Yankton has fallen something like 11 feet. And I actually went out on a boat with some Corps people looking at the river there, and it looks really beautiful and got these sandbars. And as you said, it's this wild and scenic part, but you realize that the bank of the river is actually like 9 feet in the air. And so you're like, all right, this is really beautiful, but this isn't an altered landscape. Something is really off. And someone explained to me that cottonwood trees, young cottonwood trees, can't actually grow on these high banks because their roots can't hit the water. And instead you have these invasive red cedar trees popping up, which are not water tolerant on these river banks. And so again, you have this really unnatural landscape, which is sort of evolving in this strange way because of what we've done with the river. And they have a lot of problems with this down in Kansas City. The river is hungry there too. And so, again, they've paid to move water intakes. They've paid to rebuild bridge abutments. I toured one water utility that had spent $2 million of their own money to put in an auxiliary low water intake because at times of drought, the river would fall so low because, the bank, the bottom of the river had literally fallen. And it would fall so low, they had to put a barge out there to pump water to, 400,000 customers they had outside of Kansas City. So again, we're paying to not solve these problems. We're paying, because we're paying for something that we created, right? That we, the taxpayers, the federal government did this short-sighted decision-making, 2 generations ago. And now we in the present are paying and paying and paying. And that's sort of how it feels. And Sandy brought up this, and Paul Boyd talked about this notion of intergenerational equity, where you sort of create a situation that's unfair and equitable, but the costs are passed down, several generations away from you. And so we are that generation essentially, right? Who's paying the cost for these short-sighted decisions.
Yeah, I would say we've seen it in Yankton here. The city had to drill a $10 million collector well because the river dropped so low, the intakes wouldn't work here. River City, which Yankton grew up due to the river. So yeah, those costs are being passed on everywhere. So is there a resolution out there to this conflict that you've documented? That's, obviously no easy solutions out there, but is there a path forward perhaps?
Yeah, I don't know. The Missouri, as I said, there's big problems on the Missouri, and it's hard to see how you would unwind them. I guess if you can move sediment through the dam or over the dam, that would help. The obvious thing down in the Kansas City area is to stop this in-stream sand and gravel mining. So there they actually have another layer of a problem where they give permits to like aggregate companies that actually suck sand and gravel off the riverbed and sell it, that's just a private business and they have a permit to do that. So that is exacerbating the problem in the Kansas City area. So that's an easy answer. I think the Corps could, curtail or limit those permits. In terms of where you guys are, I would have to defer to Sandy and Mark in terms of solutions, because they are the really on the ground people looking for solutions. I guess my book sort of said, this is the way it is. And, clearly there were some problems with the decision-making that got us to this point. I don't know if I really have an answer. Another thing, there's sort of a bigger unanswered question, which is Louisiana doesn't have sediment, and they essentially need and want the sediment that's trapped here behind Gavins Point Dam. And I thought that was another layer of, I guess, irony or tragedy, whatever you want to call it, because they're desperate to rebuild their landmass, which is sinking rapidly, with sediment, and yet there's not much sediment in the river. And they have levied off the river and shot what sediment they do have off the continental shelf. And they're actually spending billions of dollars on a project to divert a slice of the Mississippi River into the marshland in an effort to move that river water with carrying its sediment into the marshland and build up some land again to protect New Orleans from, storm surges and hurricanes coming across the Gulf. So, they also have something of an intractable problem. And, I think they've also sort of passed a point of no return where you can't really undo it. You can't really get it back to the way it was. There's just sort of a new normal. They just have to sort of live this way. They have to adapt. But, the idea that excess sediment where you are is creating a huge problem, and a lack of sediment where they are is creating a huge problem. And it's the same exact sediment, because the Missouri used to supply something like 60% of the Mississippi sediment. So Missouri sediment is what built Louisiana. And yet, in the early to mid 20th century, the federal government made decisions that prohibited that from happening. So I don't know, maybe I'm just sort of more so musing on the facts of these occurrences than offering helpful solutions. But
well, and I think part of the resolution I was talking about too is the resolution of the Corps of its management. As we said, they're kind of in the middle, and you detailed different places where they've had different issues they've worked with. Is there something there, or is the Corps always going to be stuck in the middle between the people here and Congress?
Oh yeah, no, I think there are things that can be done. Especially, I think the Congress could clarify the Corps' missions, especially on the Missouri. So if you could realize that having the 8 authorized purposes on a so-called equal footing, with same level of priority, is essentially doing a disservice to all 8 purposes. I think Congress should think hard about costs and benefits and people and lives and the economy and the environment, and decide, which of these is more important, which of these should we focus on? Because I think putting them all on a so-called equal footing is not working and is sort of failing all 8. So I think the Congress could make the Corps' mission on the Missouri easier to execute and increase the chances of success if they were to say, okay, we realize this is impossible. Here's the priority list. And then the Corps could pursue that and not get sued because the priority list would be in the law. I think that would help tremendously, because you see a much more effective management system on other rivers where the Corps has either fewer priorities or more clearly organized and ranked priorities. So I think that's the place to start in terms of the Missouri.
Did you find any irony in the fact that, for instance, the Olmsted Dam ended up being $2 billion and change, and yet it's a public project that's basically for private enterprise? I think you used the example of the barge operators complaining that they're stalled there for some reason or other, and can't you get it going? And when you ask them, well, you want to pay to fix it? Nothing but silence. I mean, it's a public project for private business. Is there any irony there when out here they're looking for a few $1 million just to start a pilot project, and there it was well over $2 billion?
Certainly there's irony there. And again, it has to do with the sort of weird history of who the Corps serves and why. And so, again, we talked about how hard it would be in the Missouri River to deauthorize the navigation mission, because that is sort of the essence of what the Corps does. It facilitates and enables navigation. And so you get these, really expensive lock and dam projects, especially down on the lower Ohio, and they're trying to do them on the lower Mississippi as well, and on up the Ohio. There's a whole list. But yeah, I think people ask good questions. And even I quote a Corps employee from St. Louis asking what I thought were some very good questions about, what are we spending? Who's being subsidized? Whose money is being spent? Who wins and who loses? And he made the point that when these huge construction projects go over budget, so there's this $3 billion lock and dam project, people aren't familiar, on the lower Ohio River called Olmsted, and it was billions, more than $2 billion over budget and more than 20 years behind schedule. And so it's just sort of a catastrophe in terms of budgeting and planning. But it's finished now, finally. But this guy said, look, who benefits when a project takes longer and goes over budget? The politicians, they get to give out jobs. The barge companies and the agricultural giants like ADM and Cargill and Bunge, they get to move their product on the river. Farmers, get cheap river transportation in the end. and the contractors and the Army Corps project managers all get a career's worth of good paying work. So the only people who really suffer, he said, is the taxpayer. And where is the taxpayer at the table when decisions to do these kinds of projects get made? So again, the sort of mechanism for deciding which projects to do and where and when and how much they cost, is very political. So, at the Olmsted ribbon cutting was Dick Durbin of Illinois and Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, two of the most powerful senators in the country. So if they want this project done, it's going to get done, right? So it comes down to Congress and who's making decisions when these bills are put together, right? So
that's something I've heard for 40 some years, so that's nothing new.
Yeah.
So
no,
you were
nothing new. And is it equitable? No. How can it be fixed? I don't have an answer, right?
Well, and then the other thing, you're out here, you met the people, you've been on the river, you've heard the stories and see what the desires are. Do you have any advice for the folks here, how best to proceed after all your observations?
Oh, no, I don't think I would propose to give advice. Again, I would ask them, what they think. I guess that's kind of what a journalist's role is. But
well, I ask because you're the outside observer.
Yeah, I guess I was struck by how how quiet that area is, how few people live there, and it sort of makes sense to me. Like, okay, we compare it to the project we just did in Kentucky. There's so many people, and there's so much activity and cities and populations. And then again, of course, political representation goes with population. So I guess maybe what I'm answering your question with is more empathy than advice. But I understand you look at a problem like the one that you all have behind Gavins Point Dam, and it's a really rural area with a very small population. And you get the sense that as you head west, you cross 100th meridian, it just sort of fades to grassland. I know that's not entirely true, but I guess, it does seem like the areas with more people and more, economic activity, more money, get what they want and get what they need. And rural areas, lightly populated areas don't. And I guess I'm noticing that all over the country, but that's what I was really struck by when I visited, I suppose, because I'd spent a lot of time on the Mississippi, which is kind of a more densely populated area, with a lot of big agriculture, a lot of industry, decent sized towns. And then, you drive up into Nebraska and South Dakota, and you just feel the houses disappearing and, the forests turning over to ranch land and rangeland. And just that change from, I guess, the lush riparian areas to the drier Western areas. But so maybe it's not advice, but I think it's empathy for maybe just like the way politics works in the United States.
Yeah, we kind of like it that way, by the way.
No, and I liked it there a lot. And that's why it's not a criticism, but I think
I know.
I understand why it's so hard for an organization like MSAC to get people to listen to them, I guess, because it seems like political favoritism and dollars from Washington are awarded based on how many voices, how many squeaks are coming from how many wheels, right?
Yeah, very good. Well, we've gone on for almost 45 minutes. Sandy, I don't know if you got more questions. I mean, I can continue if you want, or if you have questions from the panel or people have popped in there too.
Sure.
It might be time.
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions from our attendees, but please raise your hand or put a question in the chat box. One thing I might just add is that I guess one thing that I gathered from Tyler's book was that one thing we just don't have is a plan. And I think that's one thing that MSAC wants more than anything is just a plan. The people living here, they want to know what the future holds somewhat, instead of just right now the path we're on is just fill up the reservoir and decommission at some point. So I think one thing, the most basic thing we're after is a plan. And I think from our activity in June, a solutions workshop that we hosted with the Corps in Yankton, I think after that, I think it was maybe just more noticeable that, I mean, if we do pursue a pilot project, get something ongoing for many years, that the landscape isn't going to be the same as what we see today. There's going to be something that we are experiencing today that's going to be different. And there's not everyone's going to be a winner, I guess, so to speak, as we've talked about today. And no, I haven't seen any hands go up. Mark, what kind of questions do you have?
Tyler, when you looked at the big river and you just went over part of this, that the areas with population can get things done just because they have a lot of votes. How important is it that, let's say, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming work together to get things done? So whereas Kentucky can get something, Mitch McConnell can get something done there just because of the number of the population load, whereas we're going to have to work amongst the states that are affected by this sort of thing to work all in favor of certain items. Do you think it's important that we do that? Is it going to be a consortium of states working together that's going to be able to get things done?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And you know, in a dream world, I think there should be a Missouri River Authority or a Missouri Valley Authority. Those basins that have an agency like that, I think really have an efficient way for looking at the needs of the whole basin and getting them met, rather than having it be a state versus state or county versus county approach. And I don't know, there's probably no prospect in real life for that, but it does seem critical that the states work together. And there's an interesting thing on the Mississippi. They have, I think it's called Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, but it's all these mayors of the towns on the Mississippi that have gotten together and sort of formed a group, because the state, you know, a lot of parts of the state have nothing to do with the river, right, and probably don't care about the river, but all these mayors up and down the river all have similar interests. And so I'd be interested for you guys to look at what this mayor's group is doing along the Mississippi, because it seems like they have gotten quite a bit of attention for the issues that they are raising, and they've, you know, gone to Congress and made their case. And it seems like the last I checked on Mississippi River issues, it seems like some of their priorities were getting met and were getting heard. So it'd be interesting if there was another. I know they had Mr. Rick for the Missouri, and that seems like a good step, right? Getting everybody together, but it seems like that was mostly focusing on like the endangered species questions and less on sediment. So
right.
It seems like if there's any way, just to return to your point, Mark, to get different sort of people who their own constituents might be small, but if you get them all together, they can make the case, look, this sediment problem actually stretches for thousands of miles. It affects dozens and dozens of different cities. And then we can all sort of get together, create an organization, and have a bigger voice, you know, because I know Sandy, you have people in Pierre and Fort Pierre, and they have their problems there with sediment. And if you can, and those are serious problems, right, that have gone on for decades. And, you know, what if the mayors of all these cities could get together and sort of make their case all as one, that, hey, this is a problem. All these dams have this problem, and it's going to catch up with all these places eventually, right? And I think the tribes would obviously be part of that. They can make a really strong case, as the Santee Sioux Nation did when I spoke to them. So that would be a really good voice to have. So I don't know. I really don't want to give advice or tell anybody what to do, because you guys are the experts, and I'm just the one who listens and synthesizes. But
in your research, do you feel that the nation or Congress lawmakers treat infrastructure with the waterways any differently than other infrastructure needs around the country?
Oh, absolutely. It seems like it's always the last sort of a lot of people, when they talk about infrastructure, don't even think about the waterways. That's the first answer, right? They think roads, rails, bridges. That's the top line infrastructure thoughts. So I think a lot of people, especially in the coasts, don't think about the waterways at all. They don't know about the waterways. They don't know what a levee is. They don't know what a lock is. They don't know what travels on the river, why it's important. So I, having spent time in Minnesota and New York, I think can speak a little bit to kind of like the coastal perspective versus like the perspective of the middle of the country. And you really see when you go out on the coasts that people have no idea what's going on in the rivers and don't care. And, you know, again, those places have a lot of power and money. And so it's a challenge, I think, educating politicians, representatives, whoever from those parts of the country that, okay, they've got lots of roads, bridges, and rails. They get that. They need that funded. They're going to get that funded. But what is happening in the middle of the country, what's happening on the water, and how that does affect them, you know, how goods they purchase and food they eat does move on the waterways, right? And is affected by the waterways. But that's challenge, I think.
Okay, there's one other question I had. There's a couple coming in here too, but you talked a bit about climate change in your book as well, I guess. I believe, did you do some coverage of the bomb cyclone as well that came through Nebraska in 2019?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Well, so, I mean, climate change basically, simply put, just equates to more water in this part of the country and less water on the other side of the 100th meridian, give or take, right? I mean, it's kind of that simple. And so when you're talking about infrastructure, I think a lot of the assumptions that were made a generation or two ago about how high a flood is going to crest, how frequent that flood is going to be, need to be changed, are out the window. So, you know, high floods are happening more and more often. And it's not necessarily that we can't deal with it, but it's just that we need to sort of reevaluate the systems that we have. On the lower Missouri, you definitely need to move the levees farther apart, or what happened in 2019 is going to keep happening over and over again. On the lower Missouri. In the Mississippi, perhaps the levees they have are tall enough. Again, they're terrific levees, but you're going to have to use these floodways more often. You're going to have to let the water out of the river more often. You're going to have to turn it upon people's farmland, and you're going to have to find a way to make those people feel okay about that, or as okay as can be. And I think the current method of compensation, which is, you know, a one-time flowage easement to someone's grandfather of $25, is not adequate. People are never going to feel okay about that. So climate change is, in a way, is throughout the book because it's just sort of exacerbating the problems and voiding the assumptions that a lot of these structures were built upon. I see one question in the chat. What are your thoughts on the National Scenic River designation, the U.S. National Park Service, which is overlaying the Missouri area? I guess I don't know. The truth is I don't know much about that, whether or not it's positive or negative. Do you all know about that? Sandy or Mark or Jerry?
Yeah, they have sway over the river from from Gavins Point downstream and also upstream of Niobrara, where it's considered wild and scenic. It's part of the Wreck River. The Park Service has some personnel on it and a few regulations, but it's pretty, they're trying to keep it as untouched as possible. They allow camping, things like that, but not a lot of development. I might point out too, there's some ironies in all this. That before 2011, the big fight between the upstream and downstream states was they wanted more water downstream. That they complained we were holding too much water upstream. After 2011 and 2019, we've not heard those complaints, strangely enough.
Well, it seems like this area is trending back into drought territory. So I think some of those conversations might come up again.
Yeah, they're already in conservation mode for the year. So, right. Yeah. So, Sandy, a question for you. Maybe you talked about coming up with a plan. You know, you guys have had a lot of discussions. Is there a plan in the works? Or where do you go?
Right. Well, in June, we did host that solutions workshop. We're in the middle of this phase 2 part of the Section 22 study with the Corps of Engineers. And a consultant that we've hired, he's described the past as kind of this Charlie Brown episode with the football, where we have these pathways of doing something and then at the last minute it's taken away. And, you know, I still see flashes of that here recently in just what legislation is available to actually implement our plan. Hopefully in that we stakeholders in MSAC come up with one with the Corps. So we continually have to fight that and find those pathways. But yeah, I think at times we're really focused on finding that one overall overarching thing that's going to make a significant difference. And I think that's important, but there's going to be other actions that just mitigate some of the problems that we're seeing now, like in Niobrara, and just trying to keep up with the sediment that's coming in. And Mark, he might have some things to add.
Yeah, it's the Corps has been working well with us. I guess we're happy that we've gotten Paul really involved, and Paul's been always involved. But we appreciate his and the panelists that we just had for the solutions workshop, and I think we got some good ideas. The frustration always comes with the time it takes. As Sandy said, you go through things and you look like you're making some progress, and then there's crickets for quite some time. So, and that happens anytime with the federal government, and a lot of it is funding. We have to convince our legislators that this is an important project for all of us. And I know you get into earmarks and not earmarks and that kind of thing, but we just need everyone's help to obtain everyone's goal, I guess is what it is.
And I think it'll involve continuing to have open discussions and dialogues about what do people envision Lewis and Clark Lake in the area 20 years from now, what would be ideal and what's achievable 50 years from now, and so forth. And phase 2, we're really trying to tackle the economic questions as well that Tyler alluded to with the cost benefit ratio, and just the way that's been figured forever. It's not going to make sense for any project the area would want to implement. So that's one hurdle we have to cross first, and it's not that hurdle. You're not moving any sediment yet, but it's a question that has to be answered and addressed.
Yeah, Sandy, I guess I would say for you and Mark, I mean, you can see it, as we talked about, almost changing in front of your eyes. Does that add some urgency?
Well, it does. It does. We are, as I've went on for years about that, it's hard for a river city like Niobrara not being able to get a boat in the water. And we've kind of abandoned our boat ramp, and we keep moving down the river with makeshift ramps, but the makeshift ramps aren't even working anymore. You can't get a good sized boat in there. And it's frustrating because of the tourism that we lose because of no access to the river. And it's something that, yeah, to sit here and watch it is heartbreaking. I think a lot of us, and I think that's what Tyler got out of some of this, is that people love the areas that they're in. Jerry, as you said, we love the fact that we're here. We've got a nice town in Yankton that we all go to, but yet we've got the wildlife out here. We wouldn't give it up for anything. But we want to stress the fact that if we don't do something, then we're going to lose something that we've had for all these years in the near future.